Hey everybody, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I'm Mike.
Today we're going to start a whole new book. It's the book of Titus. People sometimes call it one of the pastoral epistles. It's a really exciting book, and Mike has got an intro for us, so take it away, Mike.
All right. Well, let's hit on just a couple of things here. Let's talk a little bit about, we'll talk about four things. We'll talk about the historical background. Let's talk about Titus, and as he's mentioned in the Bible. And then we'll just do one or two sentences on what the contents are, kind of a overview, and then we'll do a quick little outline of the book of Titus. So obviously the author is Paul, and the date is between 63 and 66 A.D. Most people think. Now the probable order of significant events as far as historical background goes is this. Paul was released from his house arrest in Rome, where we find him at the end of Acts, probably because his accusers did not choose to press their charges against him before Caesar. We see that in Acts 24 and then again in 28. Their case, therefore, was lost by default, and Paul was freed. So then Paul visits Ephesus, where he left Timothy there to supervise the churches and went on to Macedonia, which is what we call today now northern Greece. From there he wrote 1 Timothy, which is one, obviously the book first. We get that from 1 Timothy verse 3. Then he visited Crete, where he left Titus there to supervise those churches and went to Nicopolis in Achaia, which is southern Greece. We see that in Titus chapter 3. And then either from Macedonia or Nicopolis, he wrote this letter to encourage Titus. And then he visits Troas. We see a mention of that in 2 Timothy verse 4, where he was suddenly arrested, taken to Rome, imprisoned, and finally they took his head off. And of course, from Rome, we know that this was his second imprisonment. This is where he wrote 2 Timothy. Now let's talk a little bit about Titus as a person. We don't know a whole lot about Titus. Titus was a Gentile by birth. We know that from Galatians chapter 2, verse 3. Titus was converted through the ministry of Paul. We see an allusion to that here right in 4. And he was accompanied by Paul, he accompanied Paul to Jerusalem at the time of the Apostolic Council in Acts 15. He was Paul's emissary to the church at Corinth during the third missionary journey. We see that alluded to in 2 Corinthians verse 7, 6, and 7. And then Titus and two others took the letter we call 2 Corinthians to Corinth and urged the Corinthians to make good their promise to give to the poor in Jerusalem. So Paul left Titus in Crete to use his administrative gifts to consolidate the work there. And that's basically all that we know about Titus. We don't really know a whole lot. He's not really mentioned all that much. But it's interesting that, a whole book is named after him. Mm-hmm. As far as the contents of the book, really important topics are discussed in the letter that include the qualifications for elders and instructions to various age groups and the relationship of regeneration to human works and to the Spirit. Now, as far as the outline of Titus, it follows a pretty tightly scripted, at least for epistolatory literature, a pretty tightly scripted framework. Most letters in the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern world followed a pretty tight script. It was the opening greeting, and then it was the body of the letter, and then it was personal messages and greetings to other people that the letter whom it was addressed to would know. Now, in the opening greeting, that takes up the first 4 verses. Then in the body, really, that's most of the meat of the letter. He talks about the elders in the church, which we'll get into, which is verses 5 through 9. And they'll talk about their desirability, and their qualifications. And that's kind of as far as we'll get, I think. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, not too much, but basically, I think it's really interesting that, 1 and 2 Timothy really follow a lot of the same ideas as Titus. Timothy for a lot of intents and purposes, was very similar to Titus. Or Timothy and Titus were both converts of Paul. They were both people that Paul saw as his sons in the faith, people that he entrusted very much. He sent, as you mentioned, he sent Titus to Corinth, which was all messed up. You know, he trusted them to take care of business, trusted Titus to take care of business there, and he does. You know, he fixes Corinth, and you know, he's really trusted associate. And both of these guys are Paul's right-hand men. And you know, I think that it's important to have those kind of people, especially if you're doing something like Paul. You know, such a effective guy. He utilized Titus and Timothy and others, no doubt, in a very special way. We will probably get into a little bit more of that kind of stuff as we get going, but this letter is just jam-packed with information and doctrine and instruction. Some of the stuff you won't find anywhere else in the Bible, so it's a really awesome book to get into. So you want to just go ahead and get it started off?
Yeah, let's do. Titus, chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, for the sake of the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth, which accords with godliness. This is the greeting Paul is using to Titus, who is on the island of Crete, as we mentioned earlier. Now notice here, if we zoom out just a bit and look at the structure of the introduction, we see there's a couple of things that are interesting. That we see that we have one of Paul's classic run-on sentences here. Notice the period to this sentence goes all the way at the end of verse 4. So essentially verses 1, 2, 3, and 4 are what would be called in Greek clause analysis a central clause with, like 24 supporting clauses. Another interesting aspect about this, really the first few verses, but clearly in view here in the first verse, is that letters were often arranged, as I mentioned earlier, in a pretty standard framework, with the opening salutations oftentimes reflecting a social status between sender and receiver. Now notice here in verse 1 what Paul calls himself. He calls himself a servant and an apostle. Now some Bibles translate it a bondservant, which is even more telling. Paul is telling us exactly what his social standing is when it comes to preaching Christ. He is a servant of God. Now finally, notice here the last phrase Paul uses, accords with godliness. If you look at the background of the island of Crete, you find that Cretans were the archetype of sinful and uncouth lifestyle in the Mediterranean area. So much so that this epistle even mentions that a Cretan prophet writes that they are basically good for nothing. With that in mind, Paul is starting a letter here with what is likely the greatest need in Crete, and the most obvious change that would likely happen to a Cretan who gives his life to the Lord. The knowledge of the truth, which accords with godliness. When God works on you, he begins to move on you in such a way as to bring to you godliness, to influence you to be more and more like Jesus, all of which is in view in this epistle, and which is really in view here in verse 1.
I was listening to a commentator say when he was talking about Crete and its ways, he said the ancient world had a phrase to speak like a Cretan, which meant to lie.
Yes.
So it was.
Yeah, they were notoriously bad. Everybody was like, at least I'm not a Cretan, Right. I could be a cheapskate or a liar or a lunatic, but at least I'm not from Crete.
And again, it shows you what Titus is going into. Titus going into Corinth, which was also as infamous of a city of just Chuck Missler keeps calling it the first and second Californians. It was just so awful. And you're a Californian, aren't you? So. Okay. Anyway, okay, so verse 1 here, Paul, a servant of God, an apostle of Jesus Christ, according to the faith of God's elect, and the knowledge of the truth, which is according to godliness. So it is a really interesting salutation, as a lot of his are. That's an interesting point you brought up about mentioning the social status. A quick note on that is, as you mentioned, the word there that's rendered here according to faith, and servant is the word doulos, which is a bond slave. It's a very special term. It was the highest class of a servant. It was somebody who chose to serve, and there's what they would do is, I think we've mentioned before, is that, after your tenure was done, I think it was 7 years or something, that you had to let them go or whatever. And if at that time you wanted to choose to serve the house, then you would actually have your ear pierced by an awl. And whether or not there was an earring put there or not is sort of up to debate, I guess, in some circles. But they would pierce your ear, and it would be a status symbol of a very high-class servant that chose to be there. And it may be significant that Paul has chosen to mention that he is a servant of God before he mentions that he is an apostle. And I think it also has a lot to do with the way Paul looked at the things that were given to him. He was just serving God, a good steward. He says, an apostle of Jesus Christ according to the faith of God's elect. He continues, according to the faith of God's elect and the knowledge of the truth, which is according or leads to godliness. So Paul seems to be giving his sort of doctrinal qualifications here. Earlier, he said, according to the faith of God's elect, or all of the Christians. And here he says in this greeting that he is in the knowledge of the truth, which leads to godliness. So this intro is Paul's sort of confirming the purity of his doctrine in one sense, which seems fitting because this letter will spend so much time on the issues of doctrine, whether directly, like when he reminds Titus about the importance of doctrine, or indirectly, as we are about to see in the following verse. This is a quote from the Geneva translators. He says, he vouches for his apostleship, not for Titus, but for the Cretans' sake, both by the testimony of his outward calling and by his consent in which he agrees with all the elect from the beginning of the world. And I think that's all I have for that one. Mike?
Titus. Obviously the author is Paul, and the date is between 63 and 66 A.D. Most people think. Now, the probable order of significant events, as far as historical background goes, is this: Paul was released from his house arrest in Rome, where we find him at the end of Acts.
Hey everybody, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I'm Mike.
Today we're going to start a whole new book. It's the book of Titus. People sometimes call it one of the pastoral epistles. It's a really exciting book, and Mike has got an intro for us, so take it away, Mike.
All right. Well, let's hit on just a couple of things here. Let's talk a little bit about, we'll talk about four things. We'll talk about the historical background. Let's talk about Titus, as he's mentioned in the Bible. And then we'll just do one or two sentences on what the contents are, kind of a overview, and then we'll do a quick little outline of the book, probably because his accusers did not choose to press their charges against him before Caesar. We see that in Acts 24 and then again in 28. Their case, therefore, was lost by default, and Paul was freed. So then Paul visits Ephesus, where he left Timothy there to supervise the churches, and went on